You maybe already introduced yourself. Nate Frambach. Nate Frambach, professor at Wartburg Seminary in Dubuque, Iowa. And as he mentioned, he's been there 22 years. He comes with a wealth of experience. He did do a couple of sessions for our Vacation Bible School this summer, and some of you got to enjoy that. And this is kind of a recasting of that spiritual practices. We may or may not, yet to be determined, have Nate come back next week, or we may have Pastor Dan doing Lectio Divina. So we'll stay tuned. Okay.
Just show up.
Show up. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. We always hope you show up. So thank you so much for joining us this morning, Nate. And here it is.
I appreciate it so much. That's one of my opening slides. I can't see anything with these glasses anymore. Was to say good morning, and I'm so grateful for your staff here with whom I've been able to work a few times. Are you hearing me okay here? So Nate is fine. Birth certificate says Nathaniel. Grandmother said Nathan, but Nate is what most people call me Nate. So yeah, I've really loved working with the staff. They've been so gracious the times that I've been here over the years. Worked quite a bit for a while with Pastor Sarah, the campus ministry. When my son was a student here at Iowa, I was down at least every month to just join and sit with the student groups and join and do a lot of what I'll talk about today with the Lutheran campus ministry students. So I certainly know Pastor Sarah well, but all of your staff here, Chris has been a delight, Marissa's been a delight. So I'm always very happy to be able to join you and for opportunities to learn with you and to explore our life together as humans and as those called to be Christian in the world, and to be along with whatever God seems to be up to in any given day or week. So back to the question of the learning modalities. Let me say a little bit about that before we'll slip into.
You can move that.
Yeah, we'll slip into.
There you go.
Also, the tech person here's just been fantastic. What's that chap's name?
Doug.
Doug. Yeah, Doug. Just when I show up and have a need, and boom, he just does it. He just does it. So Doug, Roy. Sorry, Doug. I just said Doug in my mind. Roy asked about. We've been talking about the composition of the student community at Wartburg Seminary in Dubuque, where I teach. And we have three primary learning modalities now. In 2016, 2017, we saw a clear need across the system, just across the persons in period who might be called to ministry in public ways, such as word and service and word and sacrament. And we knew that there were a lot of persons who were unable to fully answer that call in that way because of limitations in their life. And we knew that there was a real backlog, as it were, in the system of persons who had a clear sense of call and who wanted to serve as a deacon or a pastor or a teacher or a cantor or however it might be in the life of the church, but they simply had life limitations. They were not able to pick up and move. And distance learning for a while was a nascent. I mean, it was just up and coming, and it hadn't been polished very well. So in 2016, 2017, we did a very significant curriculum revision at our school at the seminary, as other seminaries did also, and decided we were going to just make theological education available as best we could with theological integrity in a way that would meet the needs of students and those who were called. And that meant obviously still continuing our residential community, so students who were able to move to the seminary and study and be a part of our life together there, but also who could be a part of our life together and study and learn through distributive ways, or what often is called distance learning. So those are students who are in a place, may be continuing in a form of vocation, may just be a full-time student, but needing to be in that place. Perhaps their spouse had a job, perhaps they had children in school, they had aging parents, such as in my situation, who needed care. But they were essentially, living their life and then also being a full-time student. We call them DL students, distance learning students, so RL residential. DL, distance learning. And then we have a third tier called collaborative learning students. Those are also students who are not able to come to the seminary, but the reason is because they're embedded and engaged in congregational ministry already. And so they're students who have been serving in lay capacities as youth directors, as musicians, in many different ways, who had a clear call to continue their development, to become a pastor, deacon, but they were embedded in the life of a school. And so they remain there, and they take classes not quite full-time, but close. So they're what we call them collaborative students. They're embedded in a congregation, in a church, but they're also enrolled in classes each semester. So we had that dramatically increased our enrollment. It dramatically increased our ability to meet the needs that existed so that people could respond to God's call and serve in ways that were needed in the life of the churches. And then to the question, that's caused a continued strength in terms of our enrollment. So
how many pathways are there within seminary?
Yeah. Well, we have primarily 3 in our shop, and that would be one pathway would be those who are called to serve as pastors in word and sacrament ministry. A second would be those who are called to serve as deacons in word and service ministry. The classic analogy there being those who understand they're called to be bridge between church and community, who are certainly participating in the life of a congregation, but are also engaged in ministry in more public ways, often chaplains, advocacy ministries, feeding ministries in communities, that persons who wish to work with those who are experiencing homelessness for a period of time. Arguably the fastest growing congregation in the ELCA right now is a community called The Dwelling in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. One of our recent graduates, Pastor Emily Norris, is the lead pastor there. And this is a community that primarily works with persons who are experiencing homelessness. They're a worshiping community, but they're also a feeding community and a community that provides basic daily necessities, including shower trucks, on a daily basis. So it's a vibrant community. It's experiencing exponential growth. In fact, I'll be with them tomorrow via Zoom to work with their staff in some staff development pieces the next 2 Monday afternoons. So word and service. And then we also have a Master of Arts degree pathway for students who, perhaps those are students who wish to continue their education, master's as a part of a pathway to doctoral work. Oftentimes students who are called to teach, persons who are called to teach. Also, we've seen here in the last number of years, we've developed a encapsulated 1 year, full year-round master's degree, fully accredited, for students who are looking for a kind of what maybe used to be called a gap year program. Students, there are a lot of persons who would say go work with Lutheran Volunteer Corps or Urban Serving Corps, or opportunities for students, often but not always after college or civil or military service, who have a sense of a call but want to develop that further, and they want to develop that through service. We also learned after doing some research and listening that there were students who wanted to do that through continued learning, but who weren't quite ready to invest in another degree program yet. So we developed a 1 year master's program for students who wanted to be embedded in the life of a community. This will be a nice segue right into our conversation topic, who wanted to be integrated into the life of a community, fully ensconced in a community, but weren't quite clear yet about what pathway. But they wanted to do something that they felt would be kind of productive and a point of learning and growth for them, and also in some cases, honestly, just to be good resume building for them as well. So, but all of these students, all of our students, all of our student pathways, and whether our students are residential or whether our students are distributive learners or collaborative learners, they are all deeply integrated into the life of our community. Because of the nature of Wartburg Seminary, and our historical values and commitments. We've been a school that has forever been profoundly committed to the importance of community in the life of humans and the life of Christians together in the world. When we first embarked on the increase in the learning modalities so that we could meet the needs that existed for students, one of our main concerns was whether we could continue to hold on to that commitment about the vibrancy and the centrality of community together. For students who weren't going to actually be there physically, could we continue to foster this really vibrant sense of community that allowed students to feel like they were really a part of us? I should have worn my Wartburg Together Wherever We Are shirt, because for years now, that's been one of our phrases, has been Wartburg Seminary, together wherever we are. And somehow the Spirit helped us to do that. I mean, the Spirit led us in along ways that allowed us to continue to have and to foster this sense of really genuine community. I mean, if I had a variety of our students here from different pathways with me, I think 201, they would all say, I feel as much a part of Wartburg Seminary wherever I am as if I were in Dubuque there physically. And that was a real concern for us, but we're really grateful. We're very grateful that we have by and large been able to continue that sense of community. Not only are all of our students, wherever they are, integrated into the fulsome life of our community, our life together. We're very Bonhoeffer-esque in how we understand what it means to be human and what it means to be Christian, called to live together in the world on behalf of Christ's cause. Clearly, as a seminary of the ELCA, as a seminary, our life together is centered in Jesus Christ. But our way of being together is more Bonhoeffer-esque. So if you're familiar with the Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and specifically with Bonhoeffer's beautiful little book called Life Together, it's required reading of our students every year. Every student who joins our community reads a number of things, including some poetry that I managed to get on the list for them, and our not the least of which is our National Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. But we read together Bonhoeffer's Life Together. All of our students are integrated into the life of the community, and all of us, students, faculty, and some staff, are engaged in spiritual practices every semester, every week on Wednesdays. So at our school on Wednesdays from 11:30 to 12:30, the whole community is engaged in a spiritual practices small group. And that is central to, again, this Bonhoeffer-esque understanding of life together, that everything we do together, everything we do are opportunities for learning and growth in our life in Christ and our life together as humans in the world. And so this is a quote from chapter 3 of Bonhoeffer's book. In our meditation, we ponder the chosen text on the strength of the promise that it has something utterly personal to say to us for the day, to us for this day. So Bonhoeffer had this clear conviction that texts have life, and they speak. Texts have voice, and part of the human calling and the human challenge is to attend well to those texts. And a text can be scripture. The text can be poetry, song, prayer, art, image, natural landscape. I mean, there's a full, what some of the social scientists, a full range of referentiality when we think about text. I mean, clearly, these are texts, but there are other things that serve also as texts, that serve as windows to deeper meaning, and that beg for us to be still and to pay attention and to listen to them. This is how Mary Oliver starts, well, not quite starts, but close to starts her book Upstream. The very end of the little introduction to the first chapter of Mary Oliver's book Upstream concludes with, attention is the beginning of devotion. Attention is the beginning of devotion. And we aspire to a way of being together when we think about spiritual practices in community. We refuse to separate spiritual practices from community. It's one of our core commitments. Spiritual practices are certainly individual, but they're also collective. They're also communal. And we think it's very important to hold those together, which is why we engage in a whole variety of spiritual practices together in our life together as a community. And we aspire to be a genuine community in Christ. And it is always aspirational, because Bonhoeffer would also have us know in one of the chapters in Life Together that we are, as humans, susceptible to what he calls, I wish Dr. Nelson were here, visionary dreaming. To visionary dreaming. In other words, we can idealize community. And communities are, I mean, at least human communities are comprised of human beings, right? And so there are going to be bumps. We're not always going to get along. We're not always going to see eye to eye, as it were. It is aspirational always, but for us, it's a foundational commitment that our life centered together in Jesus Christ is a life together. And spiritual practices, very broadly understood, can be a way of helping us to foster and cultivate that life together. As Christians in God's world, yes, but also just as humans who are trying every day, unless maybe this is just highly autobiographical what I'm getting ready to say here, who every day are just trying to figure it out. I mean, I don't think any of us have it figured out. And I know in my life, every day, I'm just trying to figure out how to be the most decent, kind, responsible human in relationship to other humans. And Lord knows that I think I can probably speak for all of us that we don't always get that right. So it's aspirational, but it's noble. It is a noble way of aspiring to be a human in the world. And I try, and this is one of the things we focus on in our spiritual practices groups. Whatever the text is, whatever it is that we're pondering, that we're allowing to beg us, to beg our attention at any given time, whatever it may be, the text. We try to remember that as we make our way in the world, each and every other human with whom we interact is just trying to figure it out. And some of us, when we have different resources, right? We have different things we've been given. Wendell Berry talks about our inheritance as human beings, right? This is figurative, not literal, but all of us have an inheritance that we carry with us throughout our lives. These are the values and perspectives and understandings and commitments and mores and that we have inherited. And some of the things that we inherit, often from our families of origin, are things that become a part of who we are. They become tried and true. They help us to understand who we are and how to make our way in the world. And they serve us very well. But there are other things that we inherit that at some point along the way we think, really? But do I really want to continue with that particular belief or understanding or commitment? And that's really the hard part of our human work, is to be able to sift through the wheat and the chaff and to be, in a way, grateful for it all, but to also understand there are some things that, with a breath of kindness, just need to be blown away because it's finally become more chaff than wheat. And I've discovered in my own life, I've spent 30 years of my life trying to understand myself apart from, not alongside of, but apart from the relationship or lack thereof that I have with my father. And that was some of the hardest work that I've done in my life. I spent about 30 years trying to differentiate myself from that part of my inheritance. So that's a way, right? That's just a way of saying that in our life together in community, our spiritual practice, we try to allow them to help us, yes, understand our call and how it is that God's calling us to serve, but we also allow them to be occasions for better understanding ourselves and what it means to be a human and what it means to be a human in relationship to other people in all of the places where we live and move and have our being. Before I get to, I'm going to read this quote, and then we'll see. I'm sure we have some poets in the room who will be able to identify this before the attribution is given. What life have you if you have not life together? There is no life that is not lived in community, and no community not lived in praise of God. That's the next sentence, but I also have the attribution there. So, what life have you if you have not life together? There is no life that is not in community, and no community not lived in praise of God. This is one of the few trivia questions we'll have for today. It's not Bonhoeffer. So, T.S. Eliot.
Oh.
And I came across this years ago in the collected works of T.S. Eliot, but I believe that its origin is from the poem Rocks from the Chorus. Chorus from the Rocks. I think. Someone can fact check me on that. But it's T.S. Eliot for sure. And I don't have anything hanging on my wall right now because I haven't moved back into my office yet. But when I do have things on the wall in the office, one of the few things I have is this framed quote that a student gave me years ago from T.S. Eliot. And it is a way, it is a practice for me. There are days I need to be reminded of this aspiration, right? Because we know that there are communities that are not lived in praise of God. But the poet's point is that it's aspirational, that we were created as human beings, we're created for community. We're created to be in right relationship to one another. It is hard work. It does not always work. So it is aspirational, but it is a worthy and noble aspiration for us. And there are days, especially on the bumpy days, where I'll sit in my office and allow that framed quote to be a centerpiece for a spiritual practice, to just meditate on that and to ponder that and to reflect on why it is noble and worthy, but also why it is difficult at times, that aspiration. That's T.S. Eliot. Oh, I guess I could have waited there. I didn't realize I could separate that out. We're already past the prayer. Sorry, we've been praying through our talking. Let's pause before this introduction and set up why you're getting a kind of Wartburgian take on spiritual practices in community, and see if you have just some other reflections or questions before we move into a few more specific things. And I'm happy. My students often tell me that I teach best by digression. So that's why I have a PowerPoint, because otherwise we have limited time. And but I'm happy to have questions and to have you help leaven the conversation. So please hear me say that.
Geographically, where do you draw most students from?
Right. This year's incoming class, we have students from, I just saw these numbers, but I'm not the dean anymore. So either 35 or 37 states and 5 countries outside of the U.S. Yeah. And that's fairly indicative of where we are usually. We have, we're a small seminary at the ELCA that's in Dubuque, Iowa. But for years now, our reach has, again, with the proliferation of the technologies and the learning modalities, we've been able to reach a little farther, right? And so that's been also a point of growth for us, is the number of states and synods from which our students come, in which our students live.
Do you do anything called the senior college, where I don't want a credit, I just want to study? I mean, is there stuff like that online? Is there,
yes.
For communities, or for, like a Sunday school division?
So the short answer is yes. I was told many years ago by one of my mentors before I started teaching, I got you also back here, before I started teaching, that most professors in whatever schools they teach are paid to give long answers to short questions. So the short answer is yes, but it's also being redeveloped right now. We have a new person who's come recently as our Learning for Life coordinator or director. And so we have something called Seminary for Everyone, right? And it is mostly just discovery modules, discovery options. And I do think if you go to our website and look that up, you'll find some information there, but it's also probably going to be under construction or in development. But I'm glad to hear you ask about that because
For 6 years or?
no, it's very episodic. It's very,
No, but the development, right?
oh,
now.
no. We hope this year. Yeah, we hope to even be offering things. Well, we in fact are offering things that are kind of open and accessible to the public periodically.
Yes.
But we hope to increase that more. Please.
I was wondering if you would repeat the question.
Oh, okay.
I didn't hear it.
Got you. The question was about options or possibilities. We have kind of seminary for everyone. If you don't want a degree or if you don't want to be in any kind of a formal program, are there opportunities for learning that are more topical or specific? And so it's yes, and it's being developed right now. I'll fact check myself on that and look at the website and see, but I'm pretty sure we have some information on that there. If not, we'll make sure that.
Yeah, because as an individual,
Yeah.
your spiritual pathway to learn and grow and not necessarily, convenience of my home
Absolutely.
and the laptop, and it's just right there, and I can do that instead of all the crap that I watch on TV.
Absolutely.
Amen.
Good. Should I keep moving here? Move us along a little bit. I have a few more things to share, then we'll see what else about what other topics or things you'd like to discuss. So back to the spiritual practices and community, given the preface that I gave about how we understand that and how we seek to practice that also. So when one thinks about just such a broad range of possibilities of text that beg for our attention and that can help us grow and learn and deepen ourselves as human beings and as persons called to serve God in whatever way in the world, that takes time. And it is a kind of discipline. This is one of the things that we try to practice together also, which is why we schedule this. We don't just say this is important and we hope you get to it. We schedule it. I mean, 1 hour a week is 1 hour a week, but it's 1 hour a week. And it's something that we all do together at the same time. But it does take intentionality, right? For one to just be still and to take the time to be present to God and to one another. Part of one of my own practices, one day a month, I go out to New Mallory Abbey, which is west of Dubuque in the rolling farmland west of Dubuque. I go out to New Mallory because anyone can go to New Mallory anytime they want. I mean, if you want to stay overnight or have meals, then you see the guest, the host, who's the brother who's the host. But if you want to just any given day drop in there and go to a parlor or a room or pray the little hours, anyone can do that. And my first sabbatical, that's where I spent most of my time writing the book, and realized, wow, what an incredible gift. And there are other persons' religious communities where one can do the same thing. But I do it 1 day a week, and it's just I pray the little hours, and in between I walk and pray and read. But I put that on my calendar. I have to put that on my calendar. And so spiritual practices, whether individually or communally, it is a discipline. It can become a good habit. I don't know if you're familiar with Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, which is a book that was written now a number of decades ago, but the more contemporary understanding of practices and spiritual practices, a lot of which comes from McIntyre's work. It's central to that After Virtue is that things like practices become ensconced in our lives because we practice them. We practice them. We make them a central commitment. If you were here this summer for our chat, you may know the answer to this question. So I'll ask you to refrain. This is trivia question number 2 for the day. Okay. Being still and doing nothing are two very different things. There's only one person you need to learn to control. But the first part of that is where I find that to be very helpful wisdom, that there's a difference between being still and doing nothing, between being still and being present and just quote unquote filling time. Whether that's being present to a text, to a beautiful sunset, to another person, to the person who's preaching in worship, whatever it might be. Okay, who is it? Whose quote? Are you here? Being still and do. It is none of the kind of classic.
Einstein.
You know, that Einstein's a good gift. And Einstein would probably be flattered to know that actually it belongs to Mr. Miyagi from Karate Kid.
That's
From the newer Karate Kid, not the classic, but the newer one. Being still and doing nothing. I just left that too soon. So we like to think about being still as an occasion to be present, to be attentive, and to understand that attention is the beginning of devotion, and to listen and to hear. I mean, I'm a pastoral theologian, so I teach pretty much all of our classes in pastoral care and counseling, or at least a lot of them. And it took me about 3 rounds of CPE, clinical pastoral education, and a lot of good therapy before I started practicing as a clinician. It took me a long time to learn that there's a difference between listening and really hearing, and really receiving what another person is offering to you. I mean, it's important to listen and to be a present and active listener. But even those who listen well do not always receive what's being communicated. I want to say to hear, but it's beyond hearing for those who are challenged in auditory ways. It really is about receiving fully what another person is seeking to communicate and to share with you. And so when we listen well, we hear our way into another person's story, or we hear our way into deeper meanings that texts or images have to offer us. I don't know if you've ever just found a piece of art or something that just has just totally captured you, and that you can't look at it too many times, and you discover that every time you really give it some attention, there's something else there that you missed, right? I mean, this is the essence of the beauty of art, is there's always something else there. And there's always finally something beyond our ability as human beings to apprehend, not just to comprehend, but even to apprehend. The great Harvard literary scholar, Genesis of Secrecy, he wrote the Genesis of Secrecy. Genesis of Secrecy. Uses the image in that book, the Genesis of Secrecy, the image of a series of doors, right? That when you're engaged in a text, whether it's biblical text or a story or a poem or whatever it may be, that if one gives it enough attention, right, there are these moments of serendipitous discovery where it's like, oh wow, I've never quite seen or heard it in that way. And it's kind of like opening a door, like, oh, I've just discovered something. But when you open the door, there's another door. And then there's another door and another door, right? It's like you can never fully get behind a text. You can never finally fully understand. Because genuine understanding comes through conversation, dialogue, and discovery. This is Gadamer's premise in Truth and Method, right? Genuine understanding happens when persons are present together, seeking to help us move beyond our own limited perspectives. Because all of our perspectives are limited. No matter how smart we are, right? We can't apprehend it all or receive it all. Who is it?
Frank Kermode.
Yes, Frank Kermode. Yeah, brilliant literary scholar who taught at Harvard for decades. The Genesis of Secrecy. When we think about practicing stillness, or when we think about being still and contemplating, whatever it is in any given day, and I'm talking now like about Wartburg and our understanding of spiritual practices, but this can certainly apply to any of us in whatever our practice might be. This is the beautiful thing about a spiritual practice, of whatever it is that helps us become more fully the person God calls us to be, and to be more fully that person in relationship to others, and to develop our own spirituality, right? There's a brilliant range of things. It's not a one size fits all. I mean, there are certainly classical spiritual practices that have endured the test of time for centuries, if not eons. I mean, various forms of prayer, the Jesus prayer, centering prayer, Lectio Divina, the Ignatian rule, right? They're all, but beyond that, there is a whole wide array of ways that we can practice our spirituality and deepen our relationship with God and with others. And for some, it may be praying as we garden. We need to get our hands in God's good creation and receive what's there, for better or for worse, right? For some, it may be art. For some, it might be music. It might be poetry. There's a whole range of ways in which we can practice, if not literally, figuratively, listening and being still and receiving what God may want to be saying to us. I think of it, and I received this from a brother, from one of the brothers religious, not at New Mallory, but the first time that I went to Bardstown, where Thomas Merton was for so long, down in Bardstown, Kentucky, at Gethsemane Abbey, which is right in the heart of bourbon country. So if there are any good bourbon lovers here, you go to Bardstown, you go right along the bourbon trail there, right in Kentucky. But Bardstown, like a lot of abbeys or religious communities, has the main complex, just like New Mallory does, for instance, outside west of Dubuque. But Thomas Merton spent most of his time, at a tiny little simple hut, a remote cabin that was at least a quarter mile out in the field from the community. And it happened for two reasons. One, because Merton became very famous. I mean, he wrote and he became a very popular figure that people wanted to interact with him. And this is Trappist community, poverty, chastity, and silence, right? But Merton had this public pull from a lot of significant people around the world. And he traveled and he wrote and he spoke. And it created a lot of tension back home in the community. And so he chose to live in this little hut and to just sometimes not even take meals with the brothers, but to pray with them. Just to hope to try to decrease that tension, that friction. But Brother Jonah told me this time that I was there this first time that Merton also had this conviction that there are places and spaces that allow us to just allow things to rest before God, to just allow all things to rest, to just be still, to minimize the distractions. At Lord of Life, we're at Lord of Life in Asbury in Dubuque, where we worship at Lord of Life. And Russell comes in every Sunday from out in the country. He's a retired farmer. I don't think he's very retired, but he comes every Sunday, and often we'll sit by him, and the joy that emanates from him when he talks about how he's able to get out in his fields away from the animals and to just rest. So he's working, right? I mean, he's probably at least as well as I'm guessing, I think the last birthday we attended with him was, I think it was his 80th or 81st. But he's working. But for him, working is an opportunity to rest and be present to God when he's just out walking his fields. And it's so Windleberry-ish. Every time when I hear him talk about how he just likes to walk his land, doesn't have to do anything. He just likes to walk the land. It's a way of allowing things to rest before God. It's creating and holding space for holy moments, for a holy pause in one's life and one's community. And we can do that individually as persons. We can also do it together in a community. Again, this is something that we aspire to in our spiritual practice time at Wartburg. It's just moments of just being quiet, being still together, and to just receive whatever might be given. My spiritual director, I'll skip through this because I've said a lot of this already, but I want to get to my spiritual director's quote because she's very wise. And my wife, Diane, is a spiritual director, but this is my personal spiritual director. The centering prayer, we can come back to this. We've already talked about Mary Oliver, attention's the beginning of devotion. We'll come back to Wendell Berry. Come on, Nate. Come on, Nate. Wow, there's more here than I thought. There we go. At the beginning of every session, and this started with the very first session, I see my spiritual director usually every 3-ish weeks or so. I had a spiritual director. I didn't have spiritual direction, didn't understand what spiritual direction was. It's a classic spiritual practice. It's where we sit together with another person. It's not therapy, it's not counseling, but it's where we sit with another person who's trained and committed to helping us hear what God may have to say to us in our lives, whether about little things or big things or anything in between. Diane, my spouse Diane, is a retired counselor, school counselor and administrator, and is now a full-time spiritual director. She just had that in her heart. She retired as soon as she could, and now she loves to accompany people in their discernment as a spiritual director. But from the very first session with my current spiritual director, this is my fourth spiritual director in my journey.
Pretty tough.
What's that? No.
Pretty tough.
I just discovered it when I was a young pastor. First, I didn't know anything about spiritual direction. And I heard somebody talk about it at a workshop and a retreat. And I thought, where's this been all my life? Because I sure need this. I could sure use a little help getting some things out and discerning my own life and my own call. But she says every time, Nathan, let's remember that even the silence has a story to tell. Just listen. Let's listen. It was very disorienting the first time because I had met her just by phone, by recommendation and by phone. And so then we made our appointment, for your first time to talk. And I don't know about y'all, but often, in my work as a counselor, as a clinician, when I meet with a new client, there's always this kind of getting to know you time, right? There's the chit chat. Or as a pastor, when I would visit people for various reasons, there's always going to be an it. Like, what is it? Like, what do we really want to talk about? But to get there, you need to do a little chit chat. Talk about the weather, talk about sports, talk about your garden, whatever it might be. But the first time I sat with her, we met, walked in, sat down, and I started to say something. She went, okay. There was nothing I didn't understand about that, first of all. I was glad because it was clear. Whatever you're going to say, don't say it. And then she said this. Just remember that the silence has a story to tell. Just listen. Let's listen. And I got in that groove pretty quick. It's like, okay. And usually about the first 5 minutes, we just sit together. We're just still together. And then eventually, something.
Isn't that getting harder and harder?
Ooh. The question was, isn't that getting harder and harder? Here's the good short answer to a good question. Yes, it is. Right? We live in a world where we're just inundated with information, right? As someone years ago said, there are now at least a couple of generations who have grown up being bathed in bites since birth, BYTES, right? Just an info media saturated world, which has a lot of great things. There's a lot of wonderful things that can come through a good use of different kind of media, right? I love being able to see my nieces and nephews and what my kids are doing. I love to see the pictures because they're distant from us, but there's a but. And so it also can create a lot of distractions, and sifting through that, it can be a challenge as well.
We need that more.
I feel like we need it more, and I feel like it doesn't come easy all the time. It doesn't come easy to me all the time, I'll say. I'm certainly no expert at this. It's something that I just have to practice. And I've had to practice my way into starting pretty much every day of my life in the same way, which is in my rocking chair in a part of our house, attending to 3 things as I sit by myself. And for me, it's a psalm and a piece of music and a piece of poetry. That's how I start pretty much every day. And I do it seasonally, liturgically. I kind of have a psalm, I have a poem, and I have a song. But I always start with the silence. And sometimes it's only 5 minutes, but it's a good start. But I wouldn't do it if I didn't really commit myself to it, because it won't just happen.
Right.
Right?
I would think that since you meet with her every 3 weeks or so, you'd have all these things that you want to tell her.
Oh, yeah.
And it's
Oh,
like,
yeah.
and you're telling me to be quiet?
Oh, yeah.
I've got loads to unload on you.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Every 3 weeks to a month. Yep. No, absolutely. It is very tempting. And it takes one of my teachers used to call it a hermeneutic of suspended judgment. Like, you need to just suspend all the things that you want to say, suspend all the things that you're thinking, the questions. You get to them maybe eventually, but in time. We get to a lot. But it's usually the first 5 minutes. May I ask Chris, what's our time?
10:15, so we have about 10 more minutes.
Okay, I just want to be sensitive to that. I want to be cognizant of that. Let's pause here and just see if there are any other questions or comments or reflections. I say to my students quite often in class, usually begin, middle and end, comments, questions, complaints. Every now and then there's a good constructive complaint that helps you learn how to do something better.
How do you choose your daily psalm? I mean, is it just kind of a open up and pick, or just?
Such a great question, because I think they choose me. I read a lot of poetry and listen to a lot of music, and it's oddly, maybe not oddly, often the psalm comes last. So often I'll have read a piece of poetry and there's just a little something from it that I choose to just hold on to for a season of my life. Like, best song of all is bird song in the quiet. But first, you must have the quiet. That's a concluding piece to one of Wendell Berry's Sabbath poems, right? So like I grabbed when I read the poem and that ended it, best song of all is bird song in the quiet. But first, let's have the quiet. And I just said, I need to live with that for a while. And then I heard a song, just, one of those, just heard a song. And I thought, wow, that correlates very nicely. Those pair really well together. So maybe for this upcoming season, this would be a nice pairing. And then it sent me to scripture, like the psalm would work well here. So I think most of this, it's very organic for me. It's very, and I like to live with them for a period of time. And sometimes depending on what God gives you, what the Spirit stirs up, you're glad that Lent isn't really long. It's like Lent, it's long enough, right? Because so often what comes, say, during Lent is sobering. That's the best I got for you. Please, right here and then back, please.
So with a spiritual director, you have your 5 minutes of silence or more. And then I'm guessing she asked you what spoke to you.
Sometimes she will. The question was after, like in my case with my spiritual, and not all spiritual directors may start like this, but she does. The question was, then what? Like after your time of silence, then where do you go from there? Like, does she ask me something? Do I ask her something? It varies often. I've just learned to let her speak first. It took one time. Right? And she'll sometimes just, she'll just say, what did the silence have to say? Or sometimes she'll say, what's on your heart these days? Or sometimes she'll say, what have you been reading lately? And I'll talk, of course, about what I've been reading, and then she'll jump onto something. She'll grab a hold of something. Like I've been reading, first part of my sabbatical was very much a personal kind of journey. Some of you heard me say that my Diane and I, we've moved my mother here from North Carolina to Dubuque, to Luther Manor communities. She's living with Alzheimer's and needed to be closer to us and needed a different level and kind of care. And so that was a couple months. That was huge. It was a huge transition. It still is. But I decided to read some things that would kind of pair with that. The first book was by Atul Gawande, a book called Being Mortal. which is not for the faint of heart, I discovered. And then I'm just finishing reading a book by Nikki Gerard called The Last Ocean. They're both excellent books. So, you know, when I actually just a couple weeks ago, when she said, "What have you been reading?" And I said, "Wow, I just finished reading this book by Atul Gawande, Being Mortal." And she said, "What is being mortal like for you?" You know, let me tell you something else I've been reading. And this old Calvin and Hobbes book, I've been reading that too. Would you like to ask about that? You know, so it just varies. What's been on your heart these days? What have you been thinking about? And also last time, how's your mother? And she'll ask, how's Diane? Like, how are the people who are along with you for this journey, right? So, please in the back before we run out of time.
I'm trying to understand the whole concept. Now, you're saying that incoming students into the seminary, they're going to be introduced to this class,
There, yeah.
and it's called
Spiritual practices.
Spiritual practices. Do you then, so they meet in a class, but when do they practice like stillness together in the class, or is a concept?
Beautiful.
Is a concept introduced and then they're to go and continue that through, you know, the rest of the day?
Yes, it's yes to all that. We do it. We do these things. We practice them together.
Okay.
So each Wednesday, we have a number of groups who meet physically on our campus, but then our students who are all over meet via Zoom. Via Zoom. But whoever's taking the lead that day kind of introduces a practice, and then we do that, and then encourage each other to continue to do that for on and off for the next week. And so, you know, the Zoom, being together via Zoom, has some limitations in what you can actually do together. But there are students who will introduce something and describe it, and we'll talk about it, and then now go do this. Like, and we'll kind of report back and talk about it next week. But like if we're doing like a Lectio Divina, like we're doing a contemplative reading of a text, of a Bible text, we can do that all together right there. And then say, now come back to this a few times this week before we meet again.
I just imagine how hard it would be to be introduced to a class like this. I wish I'd had a way back, even, you know, pre what I call confirmation.
Got you. And it helps that we do this in small groups. So we do it in, there's no group the groups ideally are in the 8 to 12 range, usually right around 10 people. Please.
We're going to do this next week. So,
okay, all right, awesome.
We're going to practice Lectio Divina together, which is a great practice then for you to do at home in your personal spiritual time with God. And I found it's very helpful for me. It works great together, but it also is a wonderful practice to do on your own.
Absolutely.
So we're going to practice it next week. So come back.
Yeah, definitely do that, because Lectio Divina is one of those beautiful classic practices that one can do on one's own and one can do together with a group of people. Many of us at Wartburg, not all, but many of us, I would say probably most of us, start our classes, every class, our primary courses, with a practice. It's Lectio. We call it dwelling in the Word, but it's a version of Lectio. And in my case, my colleague Chris Dash and I, for instance, we teach a class on leadership. And the last year or two, we've used the text from Mark 10, 35 to 45. Mark 10, 35 to 45. Y'all can look that up. That would be a good little bit of homework. And we start every class by dwelling in the Word. So we'll read that 3 times, read, pause, read, pause, read, pause. Not just the professors, like whoever wishes to read it. And then we just, like, we're still with the text for a while. And then students, we usually go in pairs. What did you hear? what got your attention, what questions that you have. And then we'll come back and share out a little bit. But the commitment is a text that's kind of a figural text that we used for that particular course. In my pastoral care course last year and this year, probably I'm going to use a 2-verse text from 1 Corinthians 4, 1 to 2. What does it mean to be a steward of Christ and a servant and to be found trustworthy? It's just 2 verses, 1 Corinthians 4, 1 to 2. But it's amazing how we can spend every class, the whole semester, and at the end, we're still discovering things. Because texts are inexhaustible, especially texts that with the Spirit of God at the center of them. So I hope you have a good week next Sunday on that morning. Spend a week one morning doing that. Like, that's awesome. It's just about 10:15. And I know some of you will be going to worship, which, I mean, at least for many Lutheran Christians, we understand worship to be the central communal spiritual practice in our life together. So some of you have probably been, some of you will go to worship, but it's been really nice to be with you, and I hope to be able to return soon at some point.